Hello. In my previous talk, I talked about ipsative testing. That is a way of arranging tests so that one can measure individual students' progress. And this is done by balancing students' performance on one test against students' performance on the next test, and that next test having already been checked with another group of students. Today, however, I'm going to be talking shortly about doing ipsative testing with listening tests in classrooms such as the ones that I and perhaps many others usually work in, and those are classrooms with relatively minimal material resources. Basically, the problem that I had was I was trying to arrange an ipsative testing regime with classes of 35 to 50 students, and in classes where I could only give listening tests at one time to all students. So basically, what it would look like is everyone having the same test. So the problem is that what to do when everyone is listening to the same thing. How can an instructor balance subgroups of students to be able to measure progress of one student against the equivalent group of other students. However, before getting to that, I neglected to mention one very important point about my approach to testing, and that is that you might wonder if I'm giving different tests to different people, what do I tell the students to study? And one of my goals in language testing is to avoid what I call discipline testing, and that is to separate language ability from pure ability to memorize, which means that in my tests, the material on which students are tested, the material that is used in the tests is not related to the material that is studied in the class, which means that, for example, if the class has a textbook, and in the textbook there is a certain passage, say a reading passage or a listening piece of listening that is designed to teach how particular words, for example, are used. I do not use that material in tests. The test materials that I use are completely unrelated to the class materials, and never used in class. And I presume students will never have been exposed to the materials that make up the test before they actually take the test. And that is because I believe that one may have an advantage in having a good, in being able to memorize well. Might be an advantage different from the ability to use the language well. So I really want to be able to measure both the students who are able to or do remember what is in the textbook and what was taught in the class as such, the material that's used to teach, and the students who are not so good at memorizing. I want to be able to measure them fairly, and in my opinion, language classes are designed to, should be designed to make students better at using the language. And as much as possible, I'd like to separate the ability to memorize from that. So that is my attitude about discipline testing. So as I'm talking today, keep in mind that all of the test questions that I'm talking about, the questions that make up the tests that I use, are things that students have not been exposed to in class before. So in a sense, it's close to norm reference testing, such as the TOEIC test or the TOEFL test, or any number of well-known norm reference tests in which the material that the students see, the vehicle for testing particular aspects of language ability, are completely new to students. And that, I think, evens the levels the playing field, as people say. But in any case, the problem that I want to talk about today is the problem of how to test different students. How to test one group of students and treat different subsets of that group of students differently, using only one listening source. In my classes, I usually have one broadcast listening output, a CD player or some kind of public address-like system through which I can play a CD or an MP3 or some kind of sound source. And the way that I do this is I make up a listening test, a test that's usually a number of unrelated, a number of items that are not related to other items. And for each listening item, say a short bit of speech, I will make at least 4 different questions about one aspect of that piece of speech. The question might be testing a different kind of listening ability. For example, it might be one question might be testing the ability to distinguish between 2 closely related words. Another question might be designed to see if the student can understand the gist of a particular utterance. A third might be to understand if a student can understand the implications of that, and a fourth might be to understand if a student can understand the emotional tone of the utterance in question. So in any case, I first get copyright free. This is because I don't have so much money and often don't have time to get permission to use particular items that I'd like to have students listen to. I get a collection of copyright-free listening material, usually, of course, from the internet. And in my particular classes, I usually give in the first class of a listening class, the first session of a listening class, a level check test to find out if students basically all have the same general level, if the levels of the students, the linguistic abilities of the students are widely varied or not. And for that test, this first listening level check test, currently I'm using this kind of setup. So keep in mind that I have one CD, and on that CD, for my level check test, I have 26 items. These are 26 things that students listen to, sometimes with one person speaking, sometimes with 2 people speaking. And from that set of 26 items, listening items, I make up, I'm sorry, 36. There are 36 questions. From that, I make up, for each of 4 forms, 26 unique questions. So Form A has 26 questions, Form B has 26 entirely different questions, Form C has 26 entirely different questions, and Form D has 26 entirely different questions. And then besides those 26 questions, all of the forms have 10 questions that are common to all of the forms. This is what allows me to link the tests. Every student takes all of the 10 questions that are in common, which allows me to find the relative difficulty of the other 104 questions that only a subset of students, only a quarter of students take. And so that is how I do my level check test. And from there I can get a general idea of my students' levels. And the level check test is not included in students' grades, as is given before any instruction was given, before students have any chance to improve their language ability. And then the first real test that I give, the first test that counts for students' grades, counts towards students' grades, looks like this. The scheme looks like this. Again, I have a 40 question test now, and again split into 4 different forms. And the students who took Form A on the level check test, the first test occasion, will now take Test B or Test C or Test D. And each of the 4 forms has 20 unique new questions. So there are 80 questions across the 4 forms that only 1/4 of students will take each question. And then, besides that, there are 10 questions of new listening material that are common to all of the test forms. So again, this allows me to link the different forms and find out the relative difficulty of questions that only 1/4 of students have taken, and compare those with the difficulty of questions on other forms. Besides this, there are 10 other questions and 10 pieces of listening, 10 short recordings that are repeated from the first level check test. So you can see here on the little table that the students who are taking test form A are going to be hearing 10 things that are the same as what they heard before, but the questions are different. And the same applies for Form B and Form C and Form D. This allows me to link the tests across time so that I can find out exactly how much more difficult or how much easier the new questions on the new test, all of these 20 unique questions, 80 in total, how difficult those are compared with the questions that the students got on the level check test. And this is the first thing that allows me to find out if students are improving at all. So if students' ability scores, I'm using rationalysis of course, goes up, that means that they are improving their language in as much as I'm measuring here is improving. Their language ability is getting greater. And as you might guess, I'm sorry, I was speaking without showing you the chart. This is the chart, again, for the second test occasion, the one that really counts for students' grades. Form A has 20 new questions, and then 10 old listening items with questions that other students have already taken on the level check test. And then all of the test forms have the 10 common questions. As you might guess, the third occasion, the second group of tests that the second test that actually counts for the students' grades looks like this. The scheme looks like this. We have, in this case, 50 questions altogether, 50 listening items. The students who are taking Form A have 30 new questions, new things to listen to, plus 10 things that 10 questions that everyone gets, everyone taking each of the forms gets. And Form A also has 10 questions that are from test number 1, which is the test occasion number 2. So they're taking questions that, answering questions that other students who are presumably less able, because the time is earlier. Students who have taken, questions that students have already answered, other students have already answered. In my classes, I usually have 4 test equations, and the 4th and final test is arranged in this way in my classes. There are 60 questions in this case. There are 14 new things for students to listen to, and 50 new things for all students to listen to. Students taking Form A have 40 unique questions that only they take, plus 10 questions that every student in the class takes. And then students who are taking Form A also have 10 questions, are answering 10 questions that other students have answered in the second real test occasion, the third time they're doing this listening test. And this again allows me to link the question difficulties across time, which allows me, within error of course, to find out if students are improving. And that is, as I mentioned in my previous talk, that is the key point for me. As I see it, language teachers' goal is to enable students, enable language learners to improve their linguistic ability, not to memorize the textbook, not to understand the voices of the characters in the textbook, and so forth, but to actually improve their language ability. And the other duty of the language teachers presently is to be able to see if what they are teaching, how they are teaching, is actually allowing students to improve. As I mentioned before, using this kind of test regime allows me to change my approaches for classes, and by having these anchored scores, scores that are effectively randomly distributed across students, it allows me to find out if, to change my methods and find out if particular methods suit particular students, or particular methods are particularly good or particularly poor for improving students' abilities in one particular area or not. So the two problems that I think I've approached solving, or at least ameliorating in this kind of regime, are how to measure improvement over time, and then how to measure students' improvement against their own performances, and that is without having any kind of norm reference scale. I'm actually trying to check students' individual students' improvement. And for me, as I mentioned in my previous talk, I would very much like to reward students who are improving more differentially from students who begin at a high level and improve just a little bit. I'd like to be able to give extra reward to students who improve more, even if their final ability might not be so high compared with another student. If their improvement is large compared with a small improvement in another student, I'd like to be able to reward students who improve very well. As I mentioned, that is what I see the language teacher's task as being, to help all members enrolled in his or her classes to improve their language ability. And one always hopes that one can do that, but without ipsative testing, I believe, one is not able to see for sure if one is able to improve or not. Of course, I have very few test items and a relatively small number of students. I think I have 8,000 total students test scores at the moment. So only about 2,000 people have tried each of the questions that I'm using in my testing regime. So there is a lot of error in the measurements, but I do believe that it's better than nothing. That concludes the main point for today. However, I did want to give an idea of what an item might look like. I'd like to see if I can at least show one item from one of the tests. Please don't show your students if they might end up being my own. But this is what one item from one of my tests looks like. So we can see here, this is from test number 2, the first real test that counts for students' grades. Looks like this. On Form A, Form B, Form C, Form D, there are 4 different questions. These are questions about Dizzy Gillespie, taken from a short passage from a copyright-free reading of Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page related to the musician Dizzy Gillespie. And the questions that I have are, why did he lose his job? Why did Dizzy Gillespie lose his job? And there are 3 answers listed here. He stabbed his boss. He only wanted to play Chinese music. And also that there was no information in the passage regarding why he lost his job. The second question for the second group of students, those taking Form B, is what does Chinese music mean here? We can see the 3 answers down here. The question for Form C is a vocabulary question. That is because I often teach word roots in my classes, and I do expect students to be able to understand what X means in this case. And then Form D is, has a question where students have to draw a conclusion from what is presented in the listening. I'm going to click on this and see if perhaps I can get the sound running here. I'm not sure if this will work. Ah, yes, it is working. I hope that it's... So that is a typical item from my listening tests, and I use these tests for all of my students, and these might be students who have been raised part of their lives in English-speaking countries. They might be students who have studied very, very little English in their lives. So the range of questions, the range of difficulties on my tests is fairly wide. These are challenging tests. I warn the students about that beforehand. I tell them that I am measuring their general English ability and do my best to keep them from worrying too much. But that is how I approach this problem of resources. Ideally, I would be giving randomly selected items to a randomly selected and unique set of items to each student in the class. Unfortunately, I don't have the facilities to do that. Perhaps in the future, when each student is given a computer to use, I might be able to work out that kind of computer adaptive regime. But at present, as a regular classroom teacher, I'm limited in what I can do. And that is how I've approached some of the problems that some of you might face in your own listening instruction classes. That is all for today. I thank you very much for listening, and of course I welcome any comments or questions, which can be, I believe, will show up on my Google Plus page. Thank you very much, and goodbye.